Well, China has become the world's fifth largest arms exporter. What does this mean? My guest is Pascal Ab. He is a PhD candidate at the German Institute of Global and Area Studies. Pascal, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for calling me, Rick.
First of all, is this a major international development in that China replaces Britain as the fifth largest exporter of weapons?
I wouldn't really call it a major development, or at least not a development that is significant in itself. I mean, you obviously have to see this in the context of a growing economy in China in general. And when we look specifically at arms expenditures, I mean, this is something which, in my opinion, is still very much shaped by traditional alliances and not so much, say, like a global market for arms.
So basically, this is the kind of, let's say, economic development one would expect from a growing economy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. So overall, I mean, when you have a Chinese economy that has long since overtaken many of these other countries on the list, especially, of course, Russia or the Western European nations, then, I mean, it is, I think, not so surprising that they have captured, as far as I know in this study, about 5% of the global market in arms. And when you look at where most of those weapons are going, I mean, 55%, I think, of them are going to Pakistan, which is,
right.
Of course, a very, very traditional ally of China. And this is a pattern which we're seeing in many of those other arms exports relationships as well. For example, you've got American arms which are going to Israel, German arms as well. You've got Russian arms going predominantly to India, and so on.
Is the United States still number one?
The United States, yes, of course, always number one.
In arms exports?
In arms exports, yes.
How does this in any way affect the, let's say, the balance of power in certain regions? China has said that, yes, it is now the fifth largest, but it is adhering to international law. Does it?
Mm-hmm.
Do you believe in any way that it does in any way mean there might be a change in the balance of power in certain regions where many of these arms are bought?
I wouldn't expect that, no, because, well, as long as you've got maybe 5% of the global market, and that is highly fractured between many different nations, I mean, that is, in my opinion, simply not sufficient to affect the balance of power meaningfully in any of these areas. This is very, very small when you compare it to major arms transfer agreements. For example, when you have the American agreements with Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and so on, where they are able to supply these nations with, I think, 50 to 60 billion yearly arms. And, of course, they can also pay for it with the oil revenues which they're getting. I mean, this is definitely shaping the regional balance of power. But when you're looking at, I don't know, 55% of those 5% of the global market which are going to Pakistan, and India is still the world's number one arms exporter, which the study also says, then I don't think this is meaningful, because the balance of power is, of course, affected when you look at military capabilities. But most of all, I mean, we're looking at economic capabilities, we're looking at demographics. And when you compare, for example, China's number one targets for arms exports, Pakistan, in that regard with its most important competitor, which is India, then, I mean, India is much, much larger. It has a much more dynamic and modern economy, and hence is easily able to afford much more arms imports than Pakistan is. So I think this balance of power is mostly determined by demographics and economics, and not so much by arms trades.
Give us some idea of the global arms trade and how much that's worth.
How much it's worth in general? Well, okay, that's kind of difficult to say, because we don't know how much of that is going on beyond the radar. You know,
the black market.
This is something which I mean, I can say, because I'm not strictly speaking a defense analyst or arms transfer expert. But when you look at the global market, I don't know, what we're talking about, maybe 300, 400 billion?
3 to 400 billion.
That's
Wow.
just mostly a guess. And as I said, much of that is also arms resales, of course. I mean, what the study is talking about, these are direct supplies by one state to another state. And I mean, arms trade, I think when you view it more broadly, especially trade in light arms, that is something which involves, of course, resales. It involves a huge black market. It involves, of course, in some cases, the subversion of UN sanctions on arms trades. So this is something which I don't think is possible to include in a study in such a manner.
When we take a look at some of the countries that do buy, especially poor African countries where they're actually buying arms like that, where's the money coming from?
The money for African countries?
Yes.
Well, it's mostly extracted from civil society. And in some cases, it's probably also the case that this is, kind of a mechanism where bilateral development aid is then converted into arms imports, which are drawn from the country where the original so-called development aid also originated. So, this is kind of a case where it's more something like a foreign government subsidizing arms imports by African countries.
Overall, though, and maybe this is the nature of business, but do we see from year to year more and more billions being made off arms?
Yeah, although I don't know to what extent this has been simply indexed for inflation, maybe. But overall, when you're looking at the world's global hotspots or conflict spots, we're generally, I think, seeing a decrease in intensity in state-to-state conflicts and more of an increase in more intra-state conflicts, between governments and rebel groups or some failed states where there simply is no functional government of any sort. This is something where I think when you're tracking state-to-state arms shipments, again, this is something which probably does not capture the whole extent of the global market and maybe not even the most strongly growing extent of the market.
When it comes to the countries that buy the most from China, I think you mentioned Pakistan and India,
yes.
Correct?
Not so much India, no. India has kind of a contentious relationship with China, and India is a historic ally of Russia, which also supplies most of its arms. But Pakistan, at least the study says, accounts for 55% of Chinese arms exports. This is a huge share. The second-ranked country is Myanmar, and that comes up to 8%. So this is a huge, simply bilateral relationship that is, I think, very important just for Chinese arms trade in general.
Given the fact that China is now the world's second largest economy, do you think we're going to be seeing even more in the way of China developing an arm or exporting arms to other countries simply because it is now the world's second largest economy?
Yeah, and that is also, I think, the main driving reason probably behind China displacing the UK as the number 5 arms exporter overall.
And when we take a look at Russian arms exports, is there actually really a race in any way, or is it simply that the marketplace will balance out how much a country can export and those other countries that buy? Is there any kind of arms export race here?
Well, it's kind of complicated because when you look at Russia, China itself is a major importer of arms from Russia, especially when you look at high-tech weapons. These are things which realistically only the U.S., Russia, and the Western European nations can manufacture. For example, stealth aircraft or major naval weapons platforms. This is not something which China specializes in. So, we've got, I think, different countries that are simply players in different niches of the market. And China is probably more competitive when it comes to light arms, when it comes to platforms such as vehicles or maybe tanks, small arms, and so on. Whereas for example, major aircraft platforms are still mostly dominated by Western nations and Russia.
Right.
And these are, at least as far as I know, also some of the sections with the largest profit margins in the market.
This is a fascinating topic. I think most people really don't know this side of most countries in that how much they do export regarding weapons to other countries. Again, a fascinating topic. I wish we had more time on this. Been talking with Pascal Ab. He's a PhD candidate at the German Institute of Global and Area Studies in Germany. Pascal, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for calling me.
All right. Have a good day.